Yesterday I told a story about the cattle drive that I was on when I was younger. There was a friend of mine who also went on there. He was, I think, a year younger than me. His name was Jerry Bowers. Now, Jerry and I always brought up the rear of the herd. What I didn't tell you about yesterday was what we found and what we did after we got the herd up to the head of the Florida Mesa. In order to, that last leg of the journey required that we cross the Florida River. And this was always in the spring. And in the spring, the snow tends to melt. And when the snow melts, rivers swell. Well, that's the way it was up there. We always waited until the snow was melting enough so that the grass was available for the cows to eat. And that's why we took them up to the head of the Florida Mesa. We would start, the rivers were always rushing and swollen so high, and so in order to cross this river, which was only about somewhere between 30 and 40 feet, we had to start out about 500 yards above where we were going to exit the river. And we'd push the cows in. They didn't want to go. Shoot, the river's rough, it's raging, it's deep, it's cold, it's snow runoff, so you know it's cold. But we'd herd them in, and they'd get in, and they'd start crossing the river, and they would get washed downstream. It was kind of scary to watch because you weren't sure they were going to make it. But they would swim, and they would finally get across, and they'd come out just where they were supposed to, where they could. We'd come in behind them, or just Jerry and I would, and we'd enter our horses into the river, and they didn't want to go either, but once they were in, they'd start swimming for the other side, just like the cows. It was kind of hairy. It was really hairy. I don't know why I say kinda. It was hairy and dangerous, and anything could happen. We were always lucky. Nothing did happen. But when we came out on the other side, that's where the fun began. Not too far from the Florida was this old shack. Now, the shack was about half the size of the room that I'm recording in right now. This is probably 12 by 12. I've never measured it, but it looks to be about 12 by 12. Her shack would have been about 6 by 9. And that's right, I said her shack. It seemed like this old German woman, she was in her 90s back then, this old German woman lived there. They had moved to the Durango area because her husband, who was a lawyer back east, had been advised by doctors because of TB that he needed to go west. So they moved to the Durango area, bought a ranch, set up housing there, but not very well. They built a barn, they built the house, such as it was. The story goes that in 1910, he walked into Durango and bought a car. He drove that car back to the ranch, and it was a General Electric car. He drove that car back to the ranch, parked it in the barn, and the excitement of that high speed of 15, 20 miles per hour must have overcome him, because halfway to the house he died of a heart attack. That was in 1910. That old German woman, who spoke no English, at least we never heard her, had lived there all that time, and it was probably 1950, so at least 40 years she had lived up there. Now this is above the tree line. It's rough country. It's harsh, it's cold in the winter, beautiful in the summer. And she'd lived there all that time. Well, we would go over to her house, and we'd yell out to her, "Anybody home?" This house, I told you it was small. The boards consisted, they went straight up. And when the house was built, 1910 or earlier, it was probably a solid house. But I'm sure they use green wood, and when you use green wood, it's going to shrink. Well, that's what happened to this house. And there were half-inch, at least half-inch gaps between the boards, and those cracks were all stuffed with rags. The same with the door. The door didn't fit properly. There was cracks on both sides of the door, and these were all stuffed with rags. Well, we'd holler at the house, and she'd begin pulling rags out of the door. She'd open the door maybe 6-8 inches. She'd stick an octagon-barreled rifle out the door and start yelling at us in German. And we didn't understand a single word she said, but it was kind of obvious. Get the hell off my property. And we'd always just laugh, and then we'd ride away. We'd go over to the barn where that old General Electric car was parked. And there it was, all of 20 miles on it. Hadn't been driven, that anybody's aware of, had not been driven since he brought it home that day. Well, the story goes that every year this woman would walk to Durango, a distance of about 20 miles, and she would buy a year's supply of supplies that she needed to get by. And she always paid for them with $20 gold pieces. When Jerry and I were at the barn, we were looking at this thing. Both of us wanted it. And we thought that would be just the coolest thing to date in. And it would have. It had a General Electric logo that looked just like the General Electric GE symbol that they use today. That's how we knew it was GE. And it looked identical to the buggy that I used to own that I inherited when my grandfather died. It looked identical to that, except that it didn't have any shafts. The shafts are the wooden poles that run down beside the horse that you hook the harness to. Instead, it had a tiller, and you steered it with a tiller. Oh man, how I wanted to have that car just to... Can't you imagine going to a drive-in movie in those days and that old General Electric car? Well, it's been a long time since then, 1950, this is 2020. Years have passed. I'm sure that somebody's got that car. I know she died. She probably died a year or two after we left. She was supposed to have, and who knows, a hoard of $20 gold pieces. She was supposed to be quite wealthy. And they didn't believe in banks, so they kept everything on the property. I'm sure that by now that somebody has found those $20 gold pieces and they're just giggling happily till this day. And that General Electric car is probably in a museum somewhere, restored. Well, anyway, that's my tale of what happened when we got up to the head of the Florida Mesa. I hope you enjoyed it. See you later.